Hi everyone, we're getting close to the end of the day, but really interesting speaker coming up next. Isabel Hodge is the Executive Director of the US International Council on Disabilities, where she manages a 30-year disabled-led global networking and consulting hub with relationships with other organisations of persons with disabilities right around the world. And Isabel has a very interesting background, as I've just established, a native of Scotland and a US military veteran. Prior to joining USICD, Isabel was a senior analyst for the US Department of Defence Office of Special Needs. She also serves as the Vice President of Disabled Peoples International North America and the Caribbean and is on the board of Wheelchairs for Kids International. Isabel, you're very welcome to Belfast and to Harkin.
So I'm really glad that she explained that I'm originally from Scotland, because when people hear my accent, they're like, she's kind of weird sounding. So today we are going to be discussing Article 32 in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or CRPD, and Article 27, Work and Employment, and how they kind of converge there. I just want to start by saying thank you to the Harkin Summit. I'm delighted to be here. I was on a planning committee for the first Harkin Summit several years ago in Washington, D.C. I didn't make it to France last year, or the last time they were there, but I'm really happy to be close to home. And if somebody can recommend a really good chippy, I would really appreciate it, because I'm dying for some pie and chips. So we're going to be talking about my organization, the U.S. International Council on Disabilities. We're going to be talking about one of our studies that we did on the stakeholders' understanding and monitoring of the implementation of CRPD Article 32. And then we're going to look, if we have time, we're going to look at our online course that we have available. So, as our friend who's now disappeared has said, we are a 30-year nonprofit. Our mission is to advance international disability rights. Let me get this up. It's a little challenging with all this going on. So our mission is to advance international disability rights and inclusive development, and to build bridges among the US and foreign governments, disability and human rights communities, and the private sector. And we do that through strategic advocacy, convening, training, and education. So our organization led the campaign for ratification in the US in 2012 and again in 2014. And unfortunately, we were not able to ratify. Likewise, in the UK, they ratified almost immediately in 2009, which is very impressive. So if you look on the UN CRPD website and you look for the reports that your government has submitted, there's actually quite a lot of reports, lists of issues, inquiries, a lot of documentation there, and for me it was a good read. Our board of directors consists of the leading activists and advocates in the country. So Judy Heumann is one of our board members, and Candace Cable, who's also here. She's a 9-time Paralympic champion, gold medal in the Winter and Summer Games. So I hope you have a chance to meet Candace. And she was inducted into the Team USA Hall of Fame for the Olympic Games last year. Our membership spans across the United States, and we are a U.S. National Assembly member in Disabled Peoples International. And our URL for our website is usicd.org. So on the screen here, we have Ooh, there we go. We have a little character sitting in a wheelchair in a cubicle typing it at his computer. So I'm going to assume that most of you know about the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities and CRPD. And if you don't, Professor Michael Stein from the Harvard Law School project on disability and one of the lead drafters of the CRPD has an excellent YouTube video titled The Making of the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities. So check it out. It provides a great overview and details about the drafting of this really important human rights treaty. So why are we really discussing the CRPD Article 32 and not just Article 27 in work and employment? So developed countries were concerned about how language on inclusive development might impact their own decision-making about financial assistance. They needed assistance with implementation of disability rights and emphasized the important role of international cooperation. Few donor countries had any sort of policy that required disability-inclusive approaches in their development funding, and many donors had programs that excluded persons with disabilities, including employment programs, or that supported segregated and other outmodeled and harmful approaches. So Article 32 provides a general basis for the legal obligation regarding disability-inclusive development. It is by no means the only relevant provision in the CRPD for thinking about and implementing it. This first paragraph that's on the screen, and I'll read it in a minute, makes explicit the link between international cooperation and the aims of the treaty itself. It clarifies that the aims of the treaty cannot be achieved without international cooperation, and it creates an obligation for the states to adopt international cooperation measures between states and also through partnerships with international regional organizations, civil society, especially organizations of persons with disabilities. So for our visually impaired participants, I'm going to read the slide right now. It says, state parties recognize the importance of international cooperation and its promotion in support of national efforts for the realization of the purpose and objectives of the present convention, and will undertake appropriate effective measures in this regard between and among states and as appropriate in partnership with relevant international and regional organizations and civil society, in particular organizations of persons with disabilities. So on this slide, we have the second part of this article that really goes into the measures. So such measures could include inter alia, ensuring that international cooperation, including international development programs, is inclusive of and accessible to persons with disabilities, B, facilitating and supporting capacity building, including through the exchange and sharing of information, experiences, training programs, and best practices, facilitating cooperation in research and access to scientific and technical knowledge, and providing, as appropriate, technical and economic assistance, including by facilitating access to and sharing of accessible and assistive technologies and through the transfer of those technologies. So it also goes on to say later on that the provisions of the article are without prejudice to the obligation of each state party to fulfill its obligation under the present convention. This means a country cannot use the failure to receive financial assistance through international cooperation or technical assistance as an excuse for not implementing the provisions of the CRPD. So I mentioned that our organization did a study. We conducted 3 from 2015 to 28 around Article 32 and international development. But today we're really going to focus on stakeholders' understanding and monitoring of the implementation of CRPD Article 32. Our study was comprised of 4 main components. The review and analysis of state party reports on Article 32, review and analysis of independent monitoring mechanisms, alternative reports on Article 32, the review and analysis of civil society's alternative reports, and the results of an Organization of Persons with Disabilities survey on their understanding and reporting on Article 32. So a total of 96 official country reports were reviewed, 192 shadow reports from civil society, and 22 reports from independent monitoring mechanisms were reviewed and analyzed as part of this study. So we found that 94% of the available country reports address disability-specific programming. Of that 94%, only 30% of the reports also recognize mainstream development programs that are inclusive. So a large variation in the quality and extent of reporting, with only 14% of countries providing reports that significantly address all of the aspects of Article 32, and there's a significant need for all stakeholders to improve their understanding of the article. So also, we found there were very few publicly available independent monitoring mechanism reports, representing only 23% of the countries where the state party has submitted a report, and only one of the IMMs reported on the implementation of Article 32. So there's a real shortfall there. Of the alternate reports submitted by civil society, only 23 address international cooperation. So you can see the trend here that people really didn't understand Article 32 and how to report on it. So the survey to organizations of persons with disabilities found that they're not including very often Article 32 in their reports. Only 39% of organizations report having received training on how to develop an alternative report, and 18% stated they received training on how to understand and monitor Article 32. And most of them aren't aware of their own international development agencies' policies and what these agencies are committed to do. So if you asked a national organization in the United States about the U.S. Agency on International Development and their disability policy, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you, and that's important information to have if you're in a donor country. I'm giving you a break. All right. So there were several recommendations in this study. The very first one that's highlighted says provide training for different stakeholders on the understanding and monitoring of Article 32. So that's what we really ran with. We received funding from Rehabilitation International to conduct training. We were supposed to do it in the UK. We were supposed to pilot in the UK. We're supposed to pilot in Trinidad and Tobago, in Armenia, Nepal, and also in the USA. But because of the pandemic, we had to switch from an in-person pilot to a virtual pilot. So it made things a little complicated, but we worked through it. And we used all of the travel funds that we didn't use to actually create more courses under Article 32. So these courses are available for free on the USICD website. And so I hope you take advantage of that. So let's see. Part 2. Now we're going to start talking about the right to work. On the screen here, we have a young woman who's also a character without a face, and she's sitting in a wheelchair at a desk using a computer. So I'll cover what the CRPD says about the right to work and what some of the barriers are and what an inclusive donor program or project might look like. We'll talk a little bit about CRPD monitoring and reporting and give some real examples of donor and recipient projects. Again, our study prompted a training course on Article 32, and they're all sectors that are being funded highly by international development agencies. So what is the right to work? The phrase, the right to work, cannot guarantee all people of working age a job. Instead, the right to work encompasses the right of all people to the opportunity to earn a living wage by freely choosing or accepting work and to undertake that work in safe and favorable working conditions. This right also includes the right to form and join trade unions through which people can protect their interests and advocate for safe, favorable working conditions. And in the ILO's recommendation number 169 concerning employment policy from 1984, it states the promotion of full, productive, and freely chosen employment should be regarded as a means of achieving, in practice, the realization of the right to work. If you go onto the ILO's website, there's some really great resources there. So, in considering disability legislation and policies at national, regional, or international levels, there's a wide difference in how disability is defined, which has real implication on statistical information gathering. Deficiencies in data collection methods are also problematic. And then on this slide, I have included some EU labour market participation data. So the percentage of disabilities who participate in the labour market is lower than that of persons without disabilities, so 60% versus 82%. A high percentage of young persons with disabilities abandon education systems early in comparison with young persons without disabilities, 22.5% versus 11%. And persons with disabilities are at greater risk of poverty and social exclusion than persons without disabilities, 30% versus 21.5%. The unemployment rate of women with disabilities ages 20 to 64 is much higher than that of women without disabilities, so 18% versus 10.6%. So when we look at the data for the United States, I pulled it from March, for the unemployment rate for individuals 16 to 24 was 11.2, compared to individuals without disabilities, which was 6.1%. And there's also a difference in the labor force participation rate. In the same age group, 33.4%, and without disabilities, it's 76.9%. 1.1%. So you can see, even with all of our federal and state laws, our presidential executive orders, there remains a significant employment challenge in the United States for people with disabilities. So with the adoption of the CRPD, state parties recognize the rights of persons with disabilities to work on an equal basis with others, and this includes the right to the opportunity to gain a living by work freely chosen or accepted in a labour market or work environment that is open, inclusive, and accessible to persons with disabilities. It also clarifies how states can respect, protect, and fulfill the right to work, and it goes on to address some specific steps that states should take in promoting the realization of the work by people with disabilities, including prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability regarding all areas and forms of employment, protecting the right to just and favourable conditions of work, including through the equal pay for equal work, safe and healthy working conditions, protections from harassment and resolutions of complaints, and ensuring that persons with disabilities can exercise their labour and trade union rights on an equal basis with others, and enabling access to general technical and vocational guidance programs and other placement and training services. So these are some of the other steps that are within Article 27. It's quite a lengthy article compared to many of the others. So I'll go ahead and read them. It says promoting employment opportunities and career advancement for persons with disabilities and providing assistance in finding, obtaining, maintaining, and returning to employment. Promoting opportunities for self-employment, entrepreneurship, developing cooperatives and business startups, employing persons with disabilities in the private and public sector, ensuring provision of reasonable accommodation in the workplace, promoting work experience for persons with disabilities in open labour market, and promoting vocational and professional rehabilitation, job retention, and return to work programs. So when you think about COVID, the pandemic, there's quite a few rights here that are included in the CRPD. So unfortunately, as we're all here to try and address, a lot of people with disabilities have frequently been denied the right to work. One of the primary barriers is negative attitudes and false assumptions about the capabilities of people with disabilities. And people with disabilities around the world have often been denied the right to work. Or if they are hired, they're often only hired for positions that don't utilize their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And those similar attitudes lead employers to believe that some employees with disabilities, especially those with psychosocial disabilities, may be dangerous to themselves or others in the workplace, or that customers might feel offended or feel uncomfortable by the presence of people with disabilities. Employers are also often assume that the costs of implementing disability accommodations, such as accessibility features, are prohibitively expensive. And in most extreme cases, people with disabilities may find themselves forced into abusive, exploitative slave labor or unsafe working conditions, perhaps with no pay at all. We've had situations in the United States where the government went into segregated sheltered workshops, and people were making like 50 cents an hour or less. And the shelter workshop was taking a lot of their Social Security benefits. So it's important to really monitor those types of situations. People with disabilities are denied opportunities to work in mainstream settings and may end up in, like I said, segregated settings when they don't choose those. All right. So these challenges, these attitudes, these assumptions, they don't just occur at the hiring level. It also occurs, at the continuing employment. Just, if there's a new manager that comes in and he knows nothing about disability and he's got a negative attitude, then that's challenging. And then, of course, career advancing, getting a promotion at work. So I'm going to skip over this slide, but there are some other violations of human rights. You have to think about, well, how is that person going to get to work? What does the transportation system look like? Is it accessible? Did they have the opportunity to receive an education or vocational education? So the CRPD committee and reporting. Sorry, I'm having some challenges with my thingy here. Is it? So I'm just going to skip through the CRPD monitor and reporting piece, but if you're very much interested in that, then, connect with me after. So what does an inclusive donor-funded employment project look like? It leads by example by hiring people with disabilities. It provides policy models or best practices for inclusive language in solicitations. So as the UK DFID, I think it has a new name now, is putting out solicitations, grants, or contracts, then is the language in that disability inclusive? You should include people with disabilities obviously in the design of the project if you're a donor. And then an inclusive donor-funded project will recognize that all persons with disabilities have the right to seek employment, have the right to competitive wages and promotional opportunities. And it will raise awareness of the barriers and challenges experienced by people with disabilities in the recruitment and hiring processes. It identifies and engages all potential supports and tailors these supports to meet the needs of most project recipients with disabilities, and then recognizes that governments, companies, and corporations should dedicate more resources to digital inclusion of persons with disabilities, and promotes customized, integrated, competitive employment models rather than employment in restrictive settings. And then they should be included in mainstream entrepreneurship development training and microfinance systems. And obviously, data collection is very important. They should be in projects that are funded by bilateral, multilateral agencies. They need to make sure they're collecting data on the inclusion of people with disabilities. So I have just a couple of examples of projects that have been funded under Article 32 and reported on to the CRPD committee. So in 2015, China worked with African countries to strengthen their cooperation in the field of rehabilitation, education, and employment. They pledged $5 million, and they used Rehabilitation International is the funding vehicle. So it's kind of like Finland, how they use the Abilis organization to carry out some of the development work around disability. So the CRPD committee responded to the report that they needed to provide information on the definition of unjustifiable hardship that an employer can invoke not to accommodate, and provide data on the rate of employment as compared to workers without disabilities. So that when I mentioned, go to the UNCRPD website, look at the state reports, you definitely want to look at Ireland's reports and inquiries and lists of issues. This next example is from the EU. They had a project to strengthen the role of associations in promoting employment in Cuba. And the CRPD committee had comments for both the EU and Cuba, and it looks like Cuba didn't provide sufficient information about resources from another state party through international cooperation. It's like I said, it's always good to look at other reports when you're drafting your own. I'm not sure who's in the government here. Is there anyone from the government that writes state party reports? Okay, anyone from an organization of persons with disabilities that has been involved in the writing of an alternative report or shadow report? Yay! Good, good. So then you know how important it is to look at other submissions. This slide represents an example of an employment project that considers and complies with the obligations created by CRPD Article 27 and 32 regarding work and employment. So a recipient state employment project involves people with disabilities in the design, as I said before, will advocate for all international cooperation employment projects to be disability inclusive, and will educate and influence government ministries, companies, and corporations and others to dedicate more resources to improving employment outcomes and the digital inclusion of persons with disabilities. So it's important if you're with an organization to meet with your development agency within the government and other big donors like the World Bank. I know Charlotte was speaking this morning, and it's important to meet with groups like that to say, okay, do you have a policy on disability inclusion? When are you going to write when are you scheduled to write your next state party report? And then start working on your own report. So there's some other important human rights documents that you should review when you're working on the CRPD committee report. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 8. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Articles 6 through 8, General Comment number 5 on persons with disabilities of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 32 on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and the Small Island Developing States. So these are some other human rights documents you should look at. So I think I'll end there with, I hope I've provided a good overview of Article 32 and also Article 27 and the right to work, and giving you some good resources to look at as you're preparing reports. There's the resources right there. Like I said, if you go on our website and you go to our drop-down menu, there is a section titled Training and Education. I don't know if you can see. I think the screenshot moved there. There we go. That's the page that you land on. You click on that. You'll see on the next page, that's where you get your guidance documents and your tips for stakeholders on writing reports and monitoring, and then other resources there too, all kinds of videos and documents that you can download. And then those are that's the section that we have all the tips and guidance documents. I was going to do a live presentation to click through it, but I think I am almost out of time. So we have a lot of different topics that we've covered under Article 32 in this training. It's not progressive training where you have to complete the first one and go on to the next. You go to whatever lesson you want to. It really depends on what your needs are. So if you want to learn about humanitarian action, especially given what's going on in Afghanistan, Ukraine, then we have a lesson on the protection and safety of individuals with disabilities. We cover healthcare, we cover HIV and COVID, and lots of different topics. So I encourage you to go to the website USICD.org, and my email is on the screen if you have any questions or need some help with figuring out the alternative report process or the state party reporting. So with that, I'll ask if there's any questions. I know I've covered a lot, and it's not the most exciting topic, but it's exciting when you can engage with the donor and make a difference. So if you can engage with a nice foundation and say, look, I know you're really interested in Afghanistan, but are you making sure people with disabilities are included in the project that you're funding or the humanitarian assistance that you're providing? So I'm not seeing any questions. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Isabel, thank you very much. Just to say, we're going to pause now until about 4:30, and then we'll go into our final session with the keynote speakers. Bye.